Hello, this is Carl from Denmark. I usually don't make videos in English. They are usually in Danish. I made some few before, but that was a long time ago. But I'm making this one as a comment to a video I just seen. Recently I stumbled on a channel with a guy who's a true Beatles expert. I've seen many Beatles videos on YouTube, but this channel just blows me away. It's an impressive amount of knowledge. So if you are a Beatles fan, you should check out a channel called Parlogram. Okay. When I saw some of those videos, I thought, okay, he knows so much more than me, and I can't add with anything here. Until I stumbled on this one, because it's about the early days of Parlophone. And it seems that he doesn't know that much about George Martin and Parlophone in the early days, before they signed Beatles. So I would like to add a few things here about record releases of those early days. I will try to make it relatively briefly, so there's a lot of things I can't go in about. But to those who are interested in the subject, there's a bit of material I can recommend. George Martin wrote this book called All You Need Is Ears. Of course, there's a lot about the Beatles in it, but also of before the Beatles. And a good companion to that book is this CD box set with music George Martin had produced during the years. In this book, from the early days, there's one thing he mentioned. He mentioned a lot of things about recording with Peter Sellers and all those people, and he mentioned a group called the Vipers skiffle group. It was one of the big skiffle acts there back in the skiffle craze. Of course, all Beatles fans who have read about a little about it have heard that story about the Quarrymen and John Lennon being inspired by Donny Donegan, who was known as the King of Skiffle. But right behind Lonnie Donegan, there were two other big skiffle acts. That was Chas McDavid's skiffle group and the Vipers. So they were up in the top league, the Vipers. I won't go into saying a lot about skiffle and the skiffle craze. I made another video about that, one of those English-speaking videos I made long ago. I put a link to that down in the description. But I will show you something here. It's an old shellac 78 rounds per minute. This was this old thing, 10 inches records. There were actually 78s on 12 inches, mostly used for classical music. You might have heard that story about Ringo Starr saying about George Martin to us. He seemed very 12-inch, and you know, as a comment to being, you know, more cultural, or whatever you might call it, because those 12 inches were mostly used for classical music and such stuff. I can tell you this, 78, it's with Don't You Rock Me Daddy-O on the one side and 10,000 Years Ago on the other side. Those 78s are not that easy to find, and perhaps you don't have the equipment for playing them, but if you like skiffle music, there's no reason to be sad. Because there is this box set out on Beer Family. Well, it's not vinyl, I know it's that format, well, but it's 3 CDs with every recording the Vipers ever made. And actually, in the book, George Martin is talking very nicely of them, actually calling them the Beatles of the 50s. So that's something. And I think that box set is still available, as far as I know. But don't hang me up on it. But I guess it is. In that video by Parlogram, he is mentioning at some point a tune called The Sheik of Araby. As Beatles fans may know, the Beatles recorded that at the Decca session, but Parlogram doesn't seem to know that it was actually written way back in 1921. The composer was a guy named Ted Snyder, and it was inspired by the film, the movie, whatever you want to call it, with Rudolph Valentino, the Sheik. And it became very, very popular in the 20s. When bands were playing back then, the audience was requesting for it all the time. So often that the musicians grew so tired of it that among musicians it became known as the squeak of agony. And it has been recorded by almost all the jazz greats. You know, all those famous jazz musicians, you name it. It's almost, no matter who you mention, I bet you they recorded it. My personal favorite recording is by the great guitarist Django Reinhardt, but there are many, many others. And now, speaking of jazz, I should tell you that the whole idea about that video I'm doing a comment to is that he found a list of the first stereo recordings released by Parlophone and tried to get the whole package, and actually managed to, with some 2 or 3 exceptions or something, but very close to completed it. And there was one he was a little puzzled about. So was I, but for another reason. Because that's a Danish record with Papa Boo's Viking Jazz Band. And I can say so much as it must be a licensed one. I don't know if they did something to it in the E.M.I. studios, trying to do a little after production on the sound. I don't know about that. But I know for sure it was not originally released on Parlophone. Here it is, the Danish version, released on a Danish re-record company called Storyville that specialized in jazz, mostly traditional, but a few more modern releases. So, and I can tell you, this is the original one. This on Story Wheel. That Parlophone album is something on the license thing. I'm quite sure of that. I said something before about 10 inches and 12 inches. In the early days of LPs or vinyl albums, many of those were also 10 inches. Among that collection Mr. Parlogram has found, there is one called Best of Sellers with Peter Sellers. Well, that's the 12-inch counterpart to this 10-inch thing I got here. I think this is mono. PMD. Well, I guess M is for mono, so it would have been PSD if it was stereo. I guess so. I'm not sure about it. But of course it is on Parlophone. You can see the mark there. And another one he showed from that stereo collection that I got in the mono version is this one. Songs We Love by the Glasgow Phoenix Choir. Oh, there's something with the light here that make it a bit hard to see. Yes, this is the mono version of that he's got in the stereo version. And of course with those wonderful flip backs and all that. Oh yeah. One I would like to show is this one, Hump at the Conway with Humphrey Lyttelton and his band. It is not an original, it's a reissue on some obscure label called Calligraph. But what's interesting about this album, besides from having Johnny Parker on piano, I guess most Beatles fans know that it was Humphrey Lyttelton's orchestra with especially Johnny Parker's piano playing that made that re-record Bad Penny Blues that inspired Beatles to Lady Madonna. And they actually tried to get that exact piano sound. So they went out on E.M.I's store and found that microphone that were used recording Bad Penny Blues when Paul McCartney was playing the piano for Lady Madonna. So, but besides that, it gets even better. Well, listen here. It's here in the liner notes you can read. On September the 2nd, 1954, Parlophone visited the Conway Hall again. They're jumping in here, so there has been something about before. So again, sorry, visited Conway Hall again. This time they set up a tape recording machine inside the building in a little room slightly removed from the main hall. The whole thing was experimental, the idea being to record the entire concert, just as to see what happened. Nobody in the improvised control room could see the band. Messages had to be carried to and fro by George Martin. the artist's manager, and Pete Bowen, the engineer in charge. Yes. And I guess he's mentioned one time more a little later in the text. Or isn't he? No. He's only mentioned that one time, I guess. But yes, he was there. It was actually George Martin. Well, not alone. There's all those also mentioned this technician Peter Bowen, but George Martin took part of this live recording back in 1954. Well, that's 8 years before the first Beatles recording at Parlophone. Well, before I stop here, there's a last thing I want to mention. Mr. Parlogram make it sound a lot like before the Beatles. It was just comedy records, folk songs, and traditional jazz, and no pop music and no stars. Well, there actually were some stars. I mentioned the Vipers that were quite popular during the skiffle craze and was actually one of the leading groups. You know, there were hundreds of groups all over England. I tell much more about that in the other video I've made about that. But, you know, there were these top acts, and the Vipers was one of them. And another one who was very popular at the time, you know, back in the late 50s, early 60s, was this young man, Laurie London. Well, this is not an original album. Well, it's not even a reissue, it's a compilation. But I can show you a bit here of the real stuff, and I can guarantee you that's real, because these singles were bought back then. They have belonged to my mother, so they have been in the family since back then. This is his probably greatest hit. He's Got the Whole World, with the Cradle Rock on the B-side. And here is another single with Laurie London called The Gospel Train, backed with a song called Boomerang. And take a look here, that red label, just as the original Love Me Do by the Beatles. And The Whole World in His Hand is back from 57. So there were some popular acts at Parlophone. It was not just like, oh, here we got some obscure Scottish choir singing old folk songs. Well, there was a lot of that, but there was more than that. But it's correct. You know, the top acts like Cliff Richard and such guys, they were not there. They were on the other labels E.M.I. had. So yeah, you can say that Parlophone was kind of the garbage label, but still they had some popular acts. And I guess that's all I will say now. I could keep on talking and telling a lot about these matters. As I said, I put some links down below to some other videos I made some time ago about related subjects. So I'll stop here before it goes way too long. I guess it is already. So let me stop before it gets even worse.